Glad to meet everybody, and I'll give an overview of what I'm going to talk about and then jump into the details. So I'll start by talking about context. And I guess I'll start by how I met Matthew, which was by chance. Then I'll talk about myself, a little bit more background than what he described. And then I'll talk about what I've done that led him to invite me to speak here. I'll talk about the details of what I've done. And then after that, I'll talk about the results, not just what I did, but what that's led to. And I'll close with a bit of the challenges that I face going forward. And if you have questions along the way, feel free to pop in and answer and ask, but I think it'll be better if we wait till the end. I think it'll take me about 30 minutes, maybe 40 minutes to go through, a couple images to view. And so how did we meet? I was on an email for, somehow I got an email for one of your meetings. I went to it and no one was there. And it had been postponed unknown to me, but Matthew was there, and we ended up speaking for a while. How long did we speak the first time? I don't, quite a bit.
Yeah, it's about 45 minutes.
Yeah, and I think we hit on a lot of points, and he said, after talking a bit, why don't you come speak? So for context, I want to talk about, this is going to sound a little from the side, but there's a video online, which I think is one of my favorite videos online. It's of LeBron James, the basketball player, and he's practicing just the basics. It's him with a coach, and all he's doing is practicing some jump shots, doing some stretching exercises, doing some strength exercises. And in some sense, it's a very boring video because all he's doing is practicing the basics, and it's not really that exciting. For those who aren't into basketball, I've actually found very similar videos on lots of other areas, people doing with practicing piano or practicing singing or practicing dancing or almost anything where there's performance connected to it. But I'll stick with LeBron because I like basketball, and hopefully there aren't Knicks fans that are having too much of a problem with that. But another video I've seen is of LeBron James playing, it's like in a championship game, and he's running down the court, dribbling the ball. And at one point he jumps up and he's going to pass it to another player. But in the time when he jumps up, the defense gets on the other player. And so he's suddenly in the air and there's no one for him to pass the ball to. And if he lands, it's going to be a turnover. So he's in the air. He's got the time to land, to figure out what to do, but he can't pass it to anyone, and he can't hold on to it, and he can't dribble again either. And he throws the ball against the backboard, catches his own rebound, and dunks it. And it's one of the most amazing shots. The next day they interview all these basketball players, and they're like, well, that's an amazing shot, but no one does that, not in a championship game. That's like what you play in like the, to show off on courts. And the reason I mention it is that LeBron, I guarantee that they never practiced in a practice. What should we do when he's dribbling down the court, jumps up in the air, and suddenly doesn't have anyone to pass it to? What actually enables such amazing play to happen is practicing the basics. And what I'm going to talk today, and the same thing happens, a musician goes up and the instrument isn't what it's supposed to be, and they figure it out on the fly. But what makes that possible is practicing the basics. And what I'm talking today about is practicing the basics and acting sustainably. Another piece of context is when I'm talking about what I'm practicing, there's a Venn diagram that I think of how to influence other people and oneself to live more sustainably. So I'll share this Venn diagram. Does everyone see my screen?
Yes.
Okay, and so the Venn diagram is to have experience leading. It's very useful to have experience leading in order to lead. Lots of people have such experience. It's very useful to have experience in science. People who have experience leading but not experience science will often tend to lead people in the area of sustainability to do things that sound great but don't actually work because science is not trivial. People who have experience in science but not experience leading often will give people facts and numbers in the expectation or hope that they'll know what to do, and they often don't know what to do. It often doesn't lead people to act or to act effectively. Now, there's a lot of people who have experience leading and experience in science. Al Gore, Leonardo DiCaprio have some experience in these areas, I would think, I hope. Now, there's a third, which is experience living sustainably. And there are not many people, in my experience, who have experience living sustainably. And I believe it's virtually impossible to lead someone to do something that the person leading does the opposite of. And there aren't a lot of people who have experience in all three areas. Even Greta, she has a lot of experience since I believe she knows the science pretty well. I believe she has experience living sustainably, but at about 20 years old, she doesn't have a whole lot of experience leading. But this green zone in the middle is where, sorry, I live across the street from a firehouse. I'm not sure if you guys can hear that noise, but that's firehouse noise, if you can hear it. This area in here is an area where I try to get to. I have experience leading, I teach, I coach, I've run companies, I have experience in science, I have the PhD, and I'm going to talk today about experience living sustainably. I believe it's essential. And so what I'm talking about is practicing the basics, and you'll hear it, I'm describing a process that's a mindset shift that leads to continual improvement of practicing and practicing and practicing and getting to further and further stages that I don't think you can get to in one fell swoop. You have to practice and learn from each stage in order to get to the next stage. When I get to a level of mastery, of self-mastery and skill, then what I get is joy and fun and freedom. What I'm not going to talk about today, which is I'm happy to talk about on another occasion, and these are two separate things that are very closely related. I'm going to talk today about practice and deliberate practice, but I'm not going to be talking about what it leads to, which is leading others. That's a separate thing. That's like the equivalent of playing on stage, of playing on the court. So I'm not going to talk about leading others, although this is what I'm building to. I'm not going to talk about, I think you guys probably get why pollution matters. Not everyone would agree that the globe is warming or that plastic is an issue, but I'm taking for granted that people here don't need that. But if so, I can talk about that afterward. And so that's the context. A bit about me. When all of what I'm going to talk about began about 10 years ago, at that point, I had a PhD, I had an MBA, I started a company. I was also vegetarian. I don't remember a time in my life when I didn't know about the problems with pollution, the problems with litter, the problems with global warming, that sea levels were rising. As far as I know, that's always been the case from that I knew that was happening. But I also didn't act meaningfully. I mean, I'd take the bus instead of taking a taxi, but generally I would think that change on the scale that was necessary, governments and corporations were the only ones that could do it. Individual action wouldn't really matter. I didn't think that, I would think that if we didn't keep the economy going, it could collapse. And this is so I thought, what could I do? I couldn't really do much about it. So I didn't really act up until recently, about 10 years ago. And another thing that I think is important is something about how I grew up. I'll tell you about a conversation I had with my little sister a little while ago, a couple of days ago, actually, that she and her husband met doing the Peace Corps in Morocco in a destitute area. And after the Peace Corps, they both joined the State Department and worked in several places. They learned Arabic. So some of the places that my sister worked were Syria, Lebanon, where to get around Lebanon, she had to be escorted in the State Department by a cadre of Marines. And later in Baghdad, she was there. She could only be in the green zone. And her husband knew about this. And sometime not too long ago, he went to Rockland Street, which was where my mom lived after the divorce. And it was a very, very economically depressed area. And after knowing that she'd been in these war-torn areas, when she took him to Rockland Street, he was shocked. You guys lived here? How did you get out? How could this have happened? And I mentioned this, I'm not going to go into the details about Rockland Street, but accessibility has always been very important to me. I don't like to do things that are not available to everybody. Either I want things to be available or increasing accessibility to people who can't do the things. I mean, now I have Ivy League degrees and things like that. Many things are much more accessible to me now, but that has not always been the case. And I don't like to do things that are not increasing accessibility or accessible to everybody there. So that's a bit about me. Now I want to talk about 4 steps that I took that, to me, looking at the times that I did each one, I want to make very clear that before I did each of these steps, I had no expectation that I thought I could do any of them. I thought each was impossible. And I thought that each would lead to deprivation and sacrifice. I really felt I was taking one for the team, but it really had to be done. But I really thought it was really kind of pointless. Looking back now, I realized that these were stages of continual improvement, that each one enabled the next one to reach to places that I'm pleasantly surprised to find that I very much enjoy. And also in my experience, each of the stages, less than the later ones, but at the beginning, I would analyze and plan to figure out how to do each of these things. And I learned that analyzing and planning kept delaying action, and only actually doing the things led to any results at all. So this changed my outlook against too much analyzing and planning, especially if I want to tell people, if I want to lead people to do things like live more sustainably, and I have not tried it myself, I feel I don't know really what I'm talking about, especially now that I've learned it so much. So the 4 steps began about 10 years ago. I noticed that my garbage, I just looked down in my kitchen and I noticed that most of my garbage came from food packaging. As I mentioned, I thought at the time what individual action wouldn't really matter. My garbage might have been a bunch, but it wasn't, there was a lot of it, more than I really had noticed. But I didn't think that what I would do would make much of a difference. But I also thought, this garbage will end up in someone's world. Maybe not now, but somewhere over the next 500 years in the time it takes the plastic to break down. And if I can't change the world, I can still take responsibility for my effects on others. I don't want to pollute other people. And I had this idea to challenge myself to see if I could go for a week without buying any packaged food. Now, living in Manhattan, I figured, why would I do that? There are people who train their whole lives to become chefs. I can get the cuisine of the world all around here. I did grow up learning how to cook, but not from scratch. So I'd never done that before. I wasn't really sure exactly what to do. And at that point, I did start analyzing, like, what would I do on day 1? What would I do on day 2, 3, day 2, day 3? How would I do this? After 6 months of analyzing and planning, one day I just said, I'm not going to die if I'm just going to start right now, and I'll figure it out as I go. And long story short, I actually made it 2.5 weeks, the first time, of not buying any packaged food. There's actually a moment that's worth talking about when, since I just started, I allowed myself to finish packaged food that was in my cupboards and in my fridge. One day I went to the store because I needed food, and I went to, like on autopilot, I went to the shelf where I would normally start shopping. And for the first time in my life, instead of seeing the food that I saw the packaging around it, the bottles, the boxes, the jars, the cans, the rubber bands, the stickers. And it hit me that I didn't know how to buy food. I didn't know how to cook or eat without hurting other people, which is to say, I didn't know how to live without hurting people. And this was a very humbling moment that led to a lot of soul searching, because at this point I had all these degrees and I couldn't live without hurting people. I could go into that moment, but what ended up happening was I looked down at the end of the aisle was the produce aisle, the next over, and I realized, okay, I can only buy produce. And by that point, there was a bulk section in that store, and I allowed myself, if I brought my own bag, I would fill those bags up. And to that point, I'd bought from the bulk section nuts and dried fruit. But for the first time in my life, I bought dried legumes, beans. And I had no idea how to cook them. So I'm not really proud of this, but for the first time in my life, in my 40s, I boiled beans on the stove. And that's what ended up making it through this first week and the 2.5 weeks. Then I found, even within that time, I found that some of the cooking was not bad. So I decided to keep going, not at 0, but at minimal packaging. And I made it to, there's 6 months of pretty bland food, which is to say I was boiling or steaming a lot of vegetables, putting them over legumes or rice with salt and pepper. And it wasn't really particularly good, but it wasn't polluting much. And over that 6 months, I started experimenting with different things. And eventually I started making food that I considered really delicious, to the point where I invite people over. And long-term, I would do corporate events on sustainability where I would cook my famous no packaging vegan stews. And then I would go to the Bronx and Harlem and in Manhattan and lead workshops, because I found that this was, meals were very cheap, very quick and easy to make. I found that I was spending less time. I could cook faster when I was in a hurry, or longer when I had people over and I wanted to make it a social event. And so this was a tremendously joyful experience. It led me to wonder a couple things. One of them was, before I started, I thought this was going to be deprivation and sacrifice. With practice, I ended up enjoying it. And it got me thinking, why did I think that I would not like unpackaged food? Why would I not like cooking from scratch? Why did I think it was going to take so long? And why? And I realized, I'd grown up learning these things. And I asked myself, what other things, might there be other things that I think living without would be terrible, would be deprivation and sacrifice? And I hit on, this is a couple of years later, I hit on flying, and I thought to myself, could I challenge myself to go without flying for some time? And for a week, that's not enough. a month, that's not enough. And I thought, could I go for a year without flying? And I don't know about you, but I was like, oh, how could I, like, I have family, around the world, and I have to make a living, and my job depends on it. And I also think to be a citizen in society, I felt I needed to fly. And lots of people tell me, Josh, maybe you could do that, but I can't. And everything that they say after that is always something that was a challenge for me as well. And nonetheless, I decided it worked before, maybe it'll work now. So I committed to going for 1 year without flying. And all sorts of things right off the bat, family events that I couldn't go to, job events that I couldn't go to. But within a couple months, within something like 3 months, all the things that I got from flying, I found that I could get not from flying, without flying. And after a few months, I thought maybe I should go for another year. So that was 2016, and I've not flown since. So that was another thing where I thought it would be impossible. I thought it would be a terrible idea, but something I had to try. And when I actually committed and tried, it was a joyful experience. At this point, I think I'll mention that a couple of the results. No, I'll tell the other two things. One time I was reading this article on this is totally by chance. It was an article about how, mainly about, it was focusing on Vietnam, but it was talking about how most of the rest of the world, or a lot of the rest of the world, doesn't refrigerate as much as we do. They ferment, they use fresh ingredients. And I'm sitting there reading the article, and I look over at my fridge, and I'm thinking, that's the biggest source of pollution that I have right now. I wonder if I could go without using the refrigerator. And by this point, I'd learned, and I started thinking, what would I do? Can I learn how to ferment? Will that work? What would I do with this? What would I do with that? And I knew from experience, quit with the analyzing and planning. 6 months will go by, just go over. And I walked over and I just unplugged the fridge right then and there without any planning whatsoever, telling myself I got in time, the time that this stuff in the fridge is going to melt, that I have to eat it or figure out what to do with it. And in that time, I started to ferment. I just fermented a bit before that. And this was a year and a half ago. And I made it 3 months that time. This was 2019 into 2020. It was the winter. And one of the things I did was I put stuff on the windowsill. So not the tactics you use in Vietnam, which is a hot country where you do fermentation, but I'd put stuff on the window in the winter, and that would keep it cool. And I found that I was buying fresh ingredients, and I found that I could live without the fridge for 3 months. The following winter, I started a little bit earlier and went a bit longer based on my experience, and I made it 6 months. Now, then the next winter, which was this last winter, actually it was in the fall, I unplugged it in September. And so now I believe, if I've counted right, I'm in my 9th month of my refrigerator being unplugged. And amazingly, my food is fresher than ever. Normally I think of a fridge as something to keep things fresh, but it'll keep one thing fresh, but systemically, I find that it forces me, without the fridge, to have to cook differently. And for that matter, it connects with the not flying, that when I think of one of the reasons I flew, and a lot of people fly, I think, is to experience other cultures. And if people want me to make the connection more tightly, I can, but forcing myself to eat locally, what grows on farms here, and meeting the farmers and so forth, in my experience, connects me more with people in other cultures who are eating what they have locally than flying there and going there and spending a bit of time there, or eating at a restaurant, an Americanized restaurant of that version. So I feel that these things are complementing themselves very well. So that's a third thing that I did, that was this continual improvement. Each one I would never have expected to get to the second without the first, and the third without the second. The next one is actually a couple of weeks old. Well, it started last year. With my refrigerator off, I noticed that my electric bills were very low. There's one part that I can't change. It's roughly $20 that I have to pay, that's just to be connected. But then there's the amount that I pay for the electricity that I use. And my record low so far is 96 cents. And that's pretty low. And I started thinking, I wonder if I could get to zero. Could I go off grid in Manhattan, even for a month? And so I set this challenge for myself, and I wondered how I could do it if I could. So I go on Craigslist, and I looked in the used section, and I find a battery that can be solar powered. And then eventually, after a couple more months, I find, because I'm not in a hurry to do this, but I find some solar panels that are designed to be for camping, so they're portable. And I test. So here's the battery pack that I'm actually running this off of right now. And the solar panels are over there. I'm not going to show them to you. But the battery pack, I tested it with my pressure cooker, and I found that it could cook one load of my famous no packaging vegan stew, which is like my staple. And I've realized I can do this. I can pull this off. It's actually powering the light over here. And so a couple of weeks ago, I need to get the battery fixed actually. So the battery came back from the manufacturer, and I made to test this new battery, I made one of the stews, and I was thinking to myself, I wonder when I'll do this try for the month with disconnected from the grid. And I just impromptu said, I guess starting right now. So it's now Wednesday. So I'm halfway through the third week of being off the grid. So I've actually gone to the circuit, to the whole apartment, and turned off the whole circuit. So there's been no power to my apartment for 2.5 weeks. And this is, I'm beginning to see this one as my Kitty Hawk moment, which is to say, like when the Wright brothers first got flight. I can't imagine that they could have foreseen a 747 or reaching the moon. Nonetheless, it was quite a feat. And that's how I feel that this moment has been. I really did not expect to reach any of these things or succeed at any of them. So what are the results? Those are the things that I did. So let me show you this slide. Share screen again. Okay. Do you see Josh Spodek's ecological footprint? Just making sure. Okay, great. So this shows this is from an online calculator. There's plenty of other calculators that I've tried, and basically the same effect. So this was from the Global Footprint Network, which is not just carbon, but all sorts of other pollutions. And so if everybody lived as I did in 2016, then we'd need 4.3 Earths to sustain that. So that's not sustainable. At that time, the US average, according to the site, was if everybody on the planet lived as the average American did, we would need 5 Earths to cover that. So living in New York without a car, vegetarian, no kids, I was a bit below average, but I flew around. I was below average, but I flew around more than average at that time. So I was pretty close to the US average. By comparison, the world average was down at 1.7. If everybody in the world, well, that's what on average, the world needed 1.7. So that's also unsustainable. US is roughly triple, or world average is roughly a third of the US average. I think that a lot of people would look at this and think, well, a couple things. One is that I think most Americans would say, it's not fair that we have and they don't. We should bring them up to here. But this is the ecological footprint. That confuses amount of pollution with quality of life. It's not necessarily the case that the increased pollution improves quality of life. I think that a lot of Americans would look at this, and I can't speak for anyone else, but this is my guess, is that I think we would think that the world would look at us with envy. And I would guess a couple decades ago, they probably would, but with the headlines of today, I think a lot of people here look at the US with fear of pollution. When I went back to the site after 2.5 years, after 3 years, I found that when I filled out the questionnaire in 2018, this is after not flying, and a couple other changes, that my footprint was, if everybody lived as I did, we would need a third of an Earth. So I dropped 90% in under 3 years. This was all purely joyful experience. I expected it to be challenging and hard, but it was actually a joyful experience. And to my view, improved my life. And, I'm not saying everybody can do exactly what I did, but I will point out, I was already vegetarian. I already didn't have a car. I already am not a father. So the 3 areas that people can decrease their footprint the most were not available to me. So there are a lot of things that other people could do a lot more easily. So if I draw this line across here, then this green here is, loosely speaking, what you need to live. It's an upper limit on what you really need to live. And all the red part here is, to my view, not necessarily improving life. So that's the one output of this. Also, this here, hopefully you guys can see it. This is, since I compost, my garbage is dry, and I put it in this bag here, canvas bag. And this is, sometimes I like to play a game when I show that to people. Also here, when that battery came, there's 2 pieces of foam. So sometimes I ask people to guess how long I've been, like when that fills up, I go down to the hall and empty my garbage into the trash chute. And at one point it was At the beginning, I would empty my garbage roughly once a week. With practice, it came to once every other week, once every month, once every 2 months. And so the last time I emptied that was Christmas Day 2019. So on June 25th, it will be exactly 2.5 years on that load. I've been thinking to myself, if I should, I've been thinking about emptying it at that point, but now I have all these bags that my neighbors throw away, these like Fresh Direct bags, which are a bit bigger. And I'm thinking about emptying that into the Fresh Direct bag, not throwing it out, keeping it going maybe to 5 years or something like that. But that's where I am in terms of that waste. It's also led to a podcast. The podcast, This Sustainable Life, is where I bring on leaders from lots of different areas and I walk them through a process to act on to share their values on sustainability and act on them. And I've had 4 TEDx talks on sustainability leadership. I'm beginning a practice on leadership of leading people, especially other leaders, to act sustainably in a way that gets their communities to act as well. One case, I can't show this picture because I haven't gotten permission from him yet, but there's an executive at an oil company, one of the most polluting companies in the world that I've been working with. And he showed this picture of his daughter. He was walking out with her, and I'd done this process with him to lead him through this sustainability leadership process. And his daughter is now picking up litter all the time, as I do, and partly led through him to her. It's this picture of her holding a piece of garbage that she picked up because she likes it, she enjoys it. And he's using that picture to talk to other executives to say, look at what we can do, how much this can be a joyful experience, not deprivation, sacrifice. It's deeply heartwarming for me to see something like that. I hope I've given enough context for that to make sense of what I was describing. Another big effect internally is mentally, that I've gotten a great mental freedom from these emotions like hopelessness and helplessness, feeling twisted up inside when I knew that I was doing things that would pollute, but telling myself that there's nothing I could do about it, knowing that I could do something about it. Insecurity, capitulation, feelings of guilt and shame. These, look, I still pollute. I'm not living sustainably. This is garbage and it's going to be in the world for a long, long time. And by the way, I can go through and I didn't go into detail of like what's in there, but if you like, and you want me to talk about what's in there, I'm happy to show you my garbage. Oh, I should also show, I don't know if you can see over there, I put my recycling. So the big tall box on the left is my paper recycling, and the 2 boxes on the right are the metal, plastic, and glass. They're not quite 2.5 years. I think there's something like 2 years, maybe 1.5 years with the recycling. And I, by the way, I don't try to hide stuff. Like if I did a bike ride a little while ago, and at the end of the ride, they gave out sandwiches, and I took a sandwich. Without thinking about it, I took a bite into it, and I realized it was wrapped in paper. And I was like, oh crap, this paper, I don't know if it's recyclable. I don't know if it's compostable. So that piece of paper is in here. I don't try to hide things. I don't try to make it look like little. I try to take, if I produce a piece of garbage somewhere else, I take it home with me and put it in here. Same with recycling. And going back to my mental results is that I feel a much stronger sense of personal mastery, of having mastered a set of skills, not totally mastered, but I feel pretty good about also connecting with people more, the farmers that I grow the food from, my neighbors who help me with things like that. On a physical level, my diet has improved. As I do more and more sustainable things and I consume power less and less, I tend to do things that are things like exercise, learning to sing, cultural things, definitely reading a lot more, waking up earlier in order to read by sunlight instead of turning lights on, because I'm conserving power more, because I have to keep track of it. Oh, there's a really fun thing that this battery, it shows right now I'm drawing 37 watts. I have 2 more hours. It's at 13%. So I have to think to myself, will I have enough juice to do my stuff tomorrow? Or am I going to have to go upstairs climbing? I live on the 4th floor. It's 15-story building. So the roof is 11 flights up and down. And if I want to put it up there and leave it there, it takes about 4 hours to charge. I have to go up, back down, go up, come back down. So I'm climbing up a lot of stairs during this particular month. This is what happens when you just wing it just to see what happens. Somewhere down the road, I'd prefer to have something permanently installed, but this is how I find out. My co-op board wouldn't go for it, but actually the co-op is very interested in it now. I'm saving money. I'm learning skills like cooking and fermenting, shopping at farmers markets, meeting the farmers. By going to the same stands all the time, I get a lot of free vegetables because I get to know them. Can't beat free. My apartment is cleaner. My neighborhood is a bit cleaner. I pick up litter every day. I actually have physically more space in my apartment. I host people, well, pre-pandemic, I hosted people a lot more. And when I'd host people for dinners, as opposed to going to a restaurant, I could feed 5 people for less than I would pay for just myself if we went to a restaurant. And it's not really loud. I don't have the waiter isn't coming over and trying to get us out in order to get the next table in. I'm living more deliberately. I'm reading more. I'm scrolling and spending time online less. The podcast has led to connections in many different areas of leaders in lots of different areas. To this group, I'll mention Eric Adams has been on my podcast twice. Catherine Garcia has been on. Eric Botcher has been on. When he is, I presume you know who these people are. Ask me if you don't. Eric Botcher is my city council member, representative. And as part of his campaign, he organized a lot of trash cleanups. And I went to all of them. I think maybe I missed 1 or 2 if I was away. But he and I picked up litter together in February when almost no one else came out. Brad Hoyman has been on the podcast. If you guys know Rit Agarwala, who's the current chief climate officer, he has not been on the podcast yet, but we talk about this stuff. I think I mentioned the connections to other cultures, as well as human past, to farmers, to hunters and gatherers, and also to local cuisine. I forage now, and I found out places to get really cool stuff within the city. I understand science and nature in a new way, to me, a much better way. I mean, and I say this having earned a PhD, my connection to nature is deeper now, and my understanding is growing in ways I could not have anticipated. And the word to describe it most is there's much greater beauty of nature in my life now. Visually, auditorily, taste, smell, touch. I'm also becoming more aware of human blindness or a willingness, a tolerance to do things that we know will hurt others, but we find ways to excuse it. And this has led to, in my new book, well, the book proposal out, the agent is taking it to, and we're getting very positive feedback from publishers. So the new book on sustainability leadership begins with an addiction model of how we are addicted. And I don't mean by analogy or metaphor. I mean addicted in the medical definition sense. I'm not a medical doctor or psychiatrist, but I believe that we will in time professionally define what our relationship with a lot of things that pollute as addiction, and that we are choosing things that hurt ourselves in the long run for short-term reward, and we find ourselves unable to stop. That's roughly speaking a definition of addiction. And that's clarified the problem for me, that yes, it's important to understand science more. Yes, it's important to develop technologies that can make things more efficient, but at root, it's people, our behavior, and our behavior driven by our beliefs, our role models, our systems, in short, our culture. And if we don't change our culture, but we simply say change our technology, we will keep getting the same results, actually more efficiently. If we want to change the results, I believe that of the many things we have to do, one thing that I don't see people doing, and that what I'm working on, is I believe we have to change our culture, our beliefs, our role models, our systems. This is, so far, we've generally looked to scientists, educators, journalists, politicians to guide what we do next. These things are critically important. I lump them under management, working with measurable things, very, very important. But management without leadership, I don't think you can change a culture. Leadership in the style of, I believe we have to learn from people like Martin Luther King, Nelson Mandela, in sports, John Wooden, in politics, or the military, Eisenhower, that these are, and many, many other role models and effective leaders that we could learn from. And this is what is guiding me, is to bring leadership to sustainability. So this is where I am right now. There's one big challenge that I face going forward, is that there's virtually universal, many people misunderstand what I'm doing. They look at what I'm doing and they continually tell me what you're doing it's just one person. They're not getting that my goal is to lead others, to create leaders, to create leaders, to create leaders. But So I don't try to explain to everybody how personal living by my values is necessary, but not sufficient to lead others. Separately, I'm also leading others. That would be a different talk. But as I said, I feel like I'm at a Kitty Hawk moment right here, like the Wright brothers when they first flew. And there's great potential ahead of living much more sustainably, most of all, joyfully sustainably. So I hope I didn't go on too long, but this is what I wanted to share. And Matthew invited me to speak about. And I'm happy to take questions. I'm not sure if they were coming up along the way in the chat, but there we are.
Thank you, Josh. That was, I think, fascinating and very informative. And I want to open the floor up now to the members of the committee and guests for some questions. So
will you moderate? Is that the best way to do this?
Yeah, I'll do the moderating.
Okay.
Anne-Marie Cunningham, I think you have the first question. And you are muted. Mute you.
Thank you very much, Josh. I was curious to hear more about what you have done instead of flying. How do you do necessary travel?
So that's a big question I get a lot. And there's a couple things. One is I've taken vacations by bicycle. So I've gone to parks and I've camped and things like that. The biggest thing is, what do I travel for? What are the values that I'm trying to get? And can I get them otherwise? And many of the things that I believed that I needed to travel, I've been able to get without traveling. I'm sorry, without flying. So exploring other cultures, for me, exploring other cultures is very important to me. It's part of the reason I live in New York City. There's a lot of cultures in New York City. I can take the subway and get to a lot of other cultures. I'm also finding increasingly, I'm learning more and more from people nearby me. I'm also, I'm finding that there's a lot of middle steps here. I'm finding that there's a lot of travel is driven by craving. And when the detoxification goes, when the craving passes, I don't need to travel to find all these other things. I should mention that before 2016, I'd been to 6 continents, mostly by flying, a couple dozen countries, North Korea a couple times. And one could say, well, maybe you got all the travel you needed, all the flying you needed, and others still need that. I can't argue against that, but I can tell you that I wish I'd stopped flying earlier. I've developed this feeling. Oh, I should also mention that in order to give talks, I was invited to give a talk in Europe. And I'd started recognizing that if I wanted to get off North America, I took sailing lessons just on the harbor here. And sailing has taken on a whole new meaning for me, that I've only been here and on the Long Island Sound because the pandemic hit. I was actually scheduled. They had a sailboat set up for me. I was going to sail across. The pandemic hit, across the Atlantic, that is, not by myself, but with others, people being the skipper. And it really changed my view. When I thought of sailing before, I thought of this is like what the Kennedys do. It didn't occur to me that people have been doing it for thousands and thousands of years. And I spent much less money on the sailing lessons than I did on any flight. And that going on the water has been, I might be only 5 miles or a couple miles from my home geographically, but it's been a tremendous experience. The cooking has really replaced a lot of the feeling the need to go to other places. As for earning money, I had to, there's a couple things. I changed how I earned my living and had to do things much more locally. I had the ability to do that. Of course, not everybody does. I'm not trying, at no time did I decide I'm going to solve everyone's problems in the world all by myself overnight. One big thing has come to me is that, I read The Power Broker. I'm not sure if people here are familiar with Robert Moses and what happened there. I tend to think of cars as messing cities up, especially highways into cities. And this analogy, if it makes sense to you, it makes sense to you. If it doesn't, I can try to explain it more. But I think of what cars do to cities, I think airplanes do to nations. That is, people don't want to live in the middle. They want to live at the ends, and it guts out the middle part. So I'm not sure if that helps, if that answers the question. Oh, there's another thing.
I'm sorry.
Sorry, that I've also recognized that there's a lot of beauty in the world. One reason to travel is to see the Grand Canyon, is to see, not travel. I don't want to confuse flying and travel. I can travel without flying. There's more beautiful things and more people for me to meet than I could possibly reach in one lifetime. What I've learned is that my best strategy, since I can't see everything, is to enjoy what I can see maximally. And often that means what's right around me. And then when I find that there's no limit to how much joy and discovery I can get around me, and then the need to travel decreases by a lot. And it seems to be a lot of it being craving. And so I'm finding more and more near me. So sorry if I'm going on.
Sorry, no, as I want to get on to, because we have a thing. Allison, you have a question as well?
Oh, yes. Thanks. I was very interesting, very intrigued, excuse me, by your discussions that you've had with the mayor and key influencers that can influence the city, because we're basically trying to influence these people to make New York City more sustainable, drive it towards zero waste. I'm just wondering if, and I will watch your podcasts and TED Talks with the Eric Adams and Rit and those Catherine Garcia, but I wondered if you could shed any light on what they did say to you as far as what role do they see that they can play? Are they committed to this, for the city, because they are in an incredible position? What do they want to see happen?
Yeah, there's, where should I start? I mean, Eric and I don't know if you guys know about his food experience, that he was type 2 diabetic and he switched to a whole foods plant-based diet. So we really talked mostly about that being something that we could really bond on. And he sounded tremendously genuine about it. And I think that he really wants to change food, especially in schools. I haven't followed it exactly. I know there's pushback when he did vegetarian or vegan Fridays, which wasn't even vegetarian or vegan because they had the milk that was, I think, federally mandated. But he sounds to me genuine there. I think he took a black eye because he ordered fish, something like that. I have not reached him since he was elected, but talking with Rit is, he has been, since Bloomberg, very committed to cities being more sustainable. For him, it's much more climate than, my read is he's much more about climate and carbon than about litter and pollution and other types of pollution. But my read on him is that he's genuine and really passionate about it. The times that I've talked, he hasn't been on the podcast, but we've spoken. And my read is that last I spoke to him was a couple months ago, and I think he was still building the team in order to move forward. He's learned a lot from experiences with Bloomberg, that cigarettes worked, banning cigarettes worked, the soda bottles didn't. So how to make that work, I think, is a big challenge for him. Eric Botcher, I think, is incredibly genuine. I was out picking up litter, he was out picking up litter, and he was bringing a whole lot of other people to do it. But that day when we were out there in February, it was snowing and it was a wet snow. It was miserable. And there were half a dozen people out there. So I don't think, he's doing it to get votes to some degree, but I don't think you don't have to go out in February to get votes. And there weren't that many people there to make a voting difference. I think he really cared. Catherine Garcia inspired me. Her talking about the parks in the city prompted me to ride out to her favorite park, which is Gateway National Park, and have this great experience out there, which I could talk about picking berries and things like that. And I haven't seen her much since the election, but I believe that she was super genuine. I read her as very committed to this. I'm not sure what her role will end up being. I presume she'll be back in politics, but I don't know. Brad Hoyman, I live in Greenwich Village, not far from Washington Square Park. One of the things we talked about a lot was the litter in Washington Square Park, which is insanity, and the drugs in Washington Square Park, which leads to yet more, and just lots of other things there. But he very clearly sees this as I read it, as not just a bunch of individuals. It's a systemic effect. Just looking at the litter it misses that there's a system at play. One of the things that I try to talk to them about is my dream, about 20 years ago, when we banned cigarettes in the workplace and in bars and restaurants, the bars and restaurants all complained, anyone can go across the river and go to Hoboken. we're going to lose business. This is bad for business. And I'm not sure if people know what happened, but after a couple of years, Hoboken had to ban cigarettes because people were coming to Manhattan to avoid the smoke. Before they knew what clean was, they didn't know that they would prefer clean. People thought, well, you just want to drink after work and you want to smoke when you drink. Well, not when the clean is an option. I believe that, I was walking by Washington Square Park one day and there was 3 French tourists. They're speaking French. I speak a bit of French. And they were walking past the northwest corner and it was littered with garbage. And one of them turns and says, "Mais c'est dégueulasse," meaning that's disgusting. And I think of this as my backyard. My backyard, a casual observer who comes here wanting to see beauty, sees it as disgusting. I believe that, and all around Washington Square, all around the city, people are selling lots of stuff that's single-use packaging, and no store that sells this stuff has trash cans. So I've been floating with them, at least they require them to have a trash can, require them to have floor space devoted to collecting what they produce. Now, I don't think that's it. I foresee one day you can't have plastic cups. You can't have, single-use disposable things. And I think that would be a boon for business because people don't want to come to see disgusting things. They don't want to they don't want to come to New York covered with garbage. And I think people are afraid that, if we can't sell Doritos, if we can't give people to go everything, then we're going to go out of business. And I don't think there's a chance of that. I think it's going to be the opposite. So I try not to, I want to be productive, have a two-way relationship, but I also want to propose to them these ideas of mine.
Right.
I don't know if that's too long of an answer. Tell me if I should make these answers short.
No, well, we're running short on time, so I just want to get 1 or 2 other questions in. And Sharon Silverman, you've been waiting patiently, so go ahead with your question.
Hi, Josh. I found everything that you said extremely interesting, and I also sent you a note in the chat. But what would be your prescription for a society at large in terms of our goal as a solid waste advisory board is to have the biggest impact? And since you did things in sort of a methodical way, would you say your greatest impact was the first thing you did, by food-free, food waste-free or package-free food? Is that what you'd subscribe to others as the first step to take?
So
Or measuring your footprint first, so you have a scale, a measurement to go by?
There were a few questions there, and most of them were leadership related. And what I was doing was stumbling forward. And I did not, looking back now, I see that these were steps of continual improvement that followed this mindset shift that came from, this going without packaging actually improved my life. My leadership technique, and this really would be another talk entirely, but the core element of it is to start with the mindset shift, to start with switching from extrinsic motivation to intrinsic motivation. Virtually everything I see out there is, here's one little thing you can do for the environment. Here's what happens at 2 degrees. Here's what happens at 3 degrees. Here's what happens. The Pacific is full of plastic. This is what you have to do. And I'm not going to stop people from doing that. That will work with a lot of people. What I do is, the leadership technique is to first connect people with their environmental values. And the first thing is to act on that. In my case, I got lucky that the first thing I did was something that was based on my values, and I found it rewarding. When I invite people to do things, when I first evoke what's meaningful for them about the environment, what's purposeful for them, what their emotions related to the environment are, and connect those motivations, I invite them to come up with a task themselves. When they come up with it themselves, they do it because they want to. Now, big or small, it may not be big or small the first thing that they do, but when they do it, and you can listen to the podcast, when they come back for the second time, virtually every time, they do more than they expected. They enjoyed it in ways that they could not have predicted before they did. And they are open to doing more. So my strategy is to work with more and more influential people leverage points of systems, so that if politicians, CEOs, celebrities, sports stars, people like that, people that others look up to, then we can leverage community to influence others. But the big shift is to switch from extrinsic to intrinsic motivations. That would be, to get into more detail on that, it would be another talk. But
Yeah.
I'm going to go to the last question, which is Wendy Frank. If you want to give
Thanks,
your question.
Hi there, Josh. So in your building where you live, Have you tried to change the culture with the property manager and the supers, because they're the ones, the other neighbors, tenants, co-op owners that you live around? Have you tried to engage them in your lifestyle?
Yes, with mixed success at best. I formed a sustainability committee years ago, and they were open to that. And the sustainability committee met, and we were talking about things like using lower power appliances and things like that. But then we decided to get composting in the building. The pandemic hit, and that all stopped. During the pandemic, they were not really open to hearing things. Now, they've seen me carrying or putting the solar panel up on the roof, and I was kind of worried they might object to it. They didn't. The super, I had to talk to him about where I could put it because I'd leave it up there sometimes unwatched, and we worked together to find a place to put it where it's safe and where.
So this is not like a co-op, because you'd have to get that approved.
Well,
Like what?
this is a portable thing, so it's like designed for camping, so I can just leave it up there. But I think they're open to. They're definitely open to. One day I want to put up some gardening up there, and they're starting to. I think I can talk to them about putting some solar up there first as a test, but that hasn't been my main focus. They're somewhat open to it.
Okay, and the property management, because they're with the messaging when they send out their, monthly maintenance and, rental notices. What kind of engagement have you done with your property management?
I have not engaged with them much on this, so I can't speak up much to that.
All right, so we're at the top of the hour, and I think we're
This
gonna.
is how I think property management companies are like the key to, they're the management company of the building. If they want to create a greener building, they should, they usually own multiple buildings. They're, part of the real estate industry. So like, if we engage them and one building is a success, then it can move on to other buildings.
Right, so I think we're gonna have to cut it here, only because we're at the top of the hour. We've got a tremendous amount of business to get through. I wanted to say thank you, Josh, for spending the time with us, and I think this was a real eye-opener.